Tonight on The National, remembering the end of the war in Europe and Canada's part in the Allied victory. That story and more later on CBC News World.
News on the hour. Information around the clock. This is CBC News World.
VE Day plus 50. The ceremonies begin. Hello, I'm Allison Smith, and welcome. We're about to bring you the sights, sounds, and memories from a long day of ceremonies overseas. In this hour,
we salute with pride the valor of our armed forces who brought us to victory. We remember the dark days of the Battle of Britain, when the pilots of the Royal Air Force fought in our skies to protect us from invasion.
In London, a royal tribute to all the liberators.
The war in the Far East.
In Holland, the liberators on parade.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC.
And from the CBC's archives, a glimpse of those final days a half-century ago. 2 hours of memories, highlights, and special reports. Stay with us. We'll be back with all of this and more right after a brief news report.
Good evening, I'm Dave Brindle in Calgary. In the news, it is a day of remembrance and gratitude in the Netherlands. 50 years ago today, Canadians liberated Holland in the final days of the Second World War in Europe. There were ceremonies all over the country. Canadian veterans returned to a hero's welcome. More than 7,000 Canadians died liberating the Netherlands from German occupation. At a ceremony in The Hague, Prime Minister Chrétien said they did not die in vain.
The price that our young people paid 50 years ago has brought some very positive result here. And the fact that the people here remember so well their contribution.
For 5 bitter years they suffered, humiliated, brutalized, dispirited. Holland living and dying under Nazi occupation. Then, 1945, the Canadians fight their way in. The Germans surrendered. Liberation at last. The sweet taste of freedom.
50 years after VE Day, Holland remembers the liberators. Here's Allison Smith.
Good evening, and welcome to News World's special coverage of VE Day events in Europe, or welcome back if you've been following our live broadcasts throughout the day. It's the first of 4 days of celebrations marking the end of World War II. Tonight, we have the highlights, the sights and sounds of ceremonies today in London and Holland. In the town of Wageningen, there was an emotional ceremony marking one of the most important moments in Dutch history, the negotiations for the surrender of the German army. In London, the Queen began a weekend of victory in Europe celebrations. Surrounded by widows and veterans of the Second World War, she paid tribute to the men and women who gave their lives in the struggle for democracy.
We thank God for the victorious end to that titanic struggle of 50 years ago.
And at a quiet cemetery in Holland, Canadian veterans and their families came to pay their own private tributes to friends who fell on the battlefield. And the people of Holland came to express their gratitude for Canada's role in the liberation of their country. We'll have all of those highlights, and we'll look back at the end of the dark days of World War II, the military campaign that pushed the Germans to the point of surrender in Holland, and the Canadian Army's vital role in that campaign. Don Newman, the CBC senior parliamentary editor, is in London tonight. Don, no one disputes the significance of World War II itself, but describe the significance of the events of the next few days.
Well, they are very significant, Allison. Just think about it. The 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, undoubtedly going to be the last major celebration of the end of the war. Think of the vets. This is a major, major event for them. They are now, most of them in their early 70s, their middle 70s. This will be the last time that they make their pilgrimage back to where they fought so bravely a half a century ago. And think of the young people, people say born in the last 20 years. To them, the world seems like ancient history. The World War II seems like ancient history. And they are now going to get a sense of the kind of commitment that their grandparents made, that their grandparents, their grandmothers, their grandfathers made a half a century ago to secure freedom. So it is a very, very significant weekend.
Thanks very much, Don. We'll be back to talk with you in a few minutes. The centers of celebration of the end of the Second World War in Europe are London and Holland. We have two reports on the main events tonight. First to Holland and the CBC's Anne McMillan.
Their march stretched out for 2 kilometers as men from the 1st Canadian Army took to the streets of the Dutch town where 50 years ago the German Army surrendered to Canadian generals. They came from Canada, the United States, Britain, Poland, and 6 other nations. They were as welcome today as they were on May the 5th, 1945, the day Holland was liberated. In the capital, The Hague, Canada's Prime Minister met with his Dutch counterpart. He too paid tribute to the Canadians who fought for freedom.
The price that our young people paid 50 years ago has brought some very positive result here. And the fact that the people here remember so well their contribution.
It's a national holiday in Holland, and among the crowds in Apeldoorn, Colonel Gary Gould of the Sherbrooke Fusilier. With him, Maren Spielman, whose grandfather was Fusilier intelligence officer.
This is just amazing. We have flags all over, and everyone's really friendly, and it's really nice.
So I'm very glad to be here today and join this generation and the other generations and all the good people of Holland who have treated us like I've never seen anybody treat others from other countries before.
15,000 Canadian veterans and their families have come to Holland for these celebrations. They know that this will be the last major anniversary of the end of the Second World War. So both they and their Dutch hosts seem determined to enjoy every minute of this special occasion. Anne McMillan, CBC News, Apeldoorn.
They have paid attention to every detail. Rehearsing.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
And rehearsing again. From the replicas of warplanes to the flags in the pubs, London is ready to remember and to celebrate. It was the Blitz in 1940 that most remember about wartime London. Months and months of incessant bombing, and then subsequent bombing raids throughout the war killed tens of thousands and left 1/3 of the city in rubble.
Londoners heard on the radio the night before that May 8th would be VE Day. The next morning, they poured into the center of the city, clogging the streets, crowding into Trafalgar Square and Piccadilly Circus. There has never been a celebration like the one they had in London that day. And it's that spirit they're going to try to recreate this weekend.
The official ceremonies commemorating 50 years of peace began today. Queen Elizabeth asked the nation to show its gratitude to the men and women who sacrificed so much. She was Princess Elizabeth then, and her memories are vivid.
The years of the Second World War formed my youth. I remember my father and mother telling us at home of the courage and unity of purpose they encountered on all sides during their wartime travels, and of the overwhelming sense that we were all united in a common resolve.
Festivities commemorating VE Day will go on in communities throughout Britain over the next 3 days. Anna Maria Tremonti, CBC News, London.
For most Canadians, the voice that brought the war home belonged to CBC correspondent Matthew Halton. He covered all of the major battlefields of World War II, and the stories he filed were dramatic, moving, and full of insight. One of his best was filed from Holland as the Allies negotiated the German surrender. We've taken that report and matched it with some of the best film footage from that historic moment. Here's the CBC's Matthew Halton reporting from Holland in May of 1945.
When I got there, I saw at least 200 big trucks of the British 49th Division, which is part of 1st Canadian Corps. I saw them rolling across the dividing tape, carrying food for the Dutch people, carrying it through the German lines by arrangement. when I saw a small car coming along toward us. It was a wretched, shabby German Volkswagen, the equivalent of our Jeep. In it, there was the driver and two German officers, the German general and a saber-scarred colonel who was his interpreter. They were received formally and coldly by Lieutenant General Charles Folks, commanding the 1st Canadian Corps. With him was Prince Bernhard of Holland, representing the Dutch government. General Folks led the German general into the littered and broken bar of a ruined hotel to hear his term. The war correspondents present were invited to come in and listen. The German general wore a black leather coat and a shabby peaked cap. He was a red-faced, brutish-looking man. He was submissive, even abject, the very picture of a beaten man.
May I ask first if General Blaskovitz has had a copy of the order to surrender?
Der Befehlshaber möchte wissen, ob der Generaloberst eine Abschrift gehabt haben von diesen Bedingungen der Übergabe.
Ich habe, nein. Well, is the general prepared to accept my reading this and prepared to negotiate for turning his troops over to me?
So it was over. When the people heard the news on the radio, they ran into the streets to tell their friends, with 120,000 Germans laying down their arms in an almost hysterical surrender, begging us, as von Blaskovitz did, to protect them from the angry Dutch. Today the world is happy. 10 million men pinch themselves and feel that they're still alive, and will soon be lying on the lawn listening to their wives and babies. But one phrase keeps running through my head. It's an old phrase that every schoolboy knows. The words of a Canadian who died in the last war. Words more solemn and meaningful than ever before. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies blow in Flanders field. And now, not only on Flanders field, poppies grow, I've seen them, at Regal Buto and Agira in Sicily, and up the length of Italy, in Normandy, France, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Regal Buto, Moro River, Carpiquet, and the appalling hill at Capelne. The sun shines now. But remember these names, Canada, because they're written on your heart. This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Germany.
As Matthew Halton reported a half-century ago, the German forces occupying the Netherlands surrendered to the Canadian Army in the town of Wageningen. On this day, dawn in 1945, Lieutenant General Folks, the commander of the 1st Canadian Corps, formally accepted the surrender from his German counterpart, General Johann Blaskovitz.
And you know, Alison, also in the room on that historic day was Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, representing his people as they reacquired their freedom. Well, Prince Bernhard was back in Wageningen again today to review a parade of veterans. And leading the parade in pride of place were the veterans from Canada. Here are the highlights. And here is Prince Bernhard. His health has not been very good lately, and there was some doubt whether he would appear today. This is Major General George Kitching, retired from the Canadian Armed Forces. He was Folk's Chief of Staff, and he is now the only surviving Canadian who witnessed the German surrender. Shortly before the surrender ceremony in Van Ginningen, there was a memorial service. The service was held at the St. John the Baptist Nativity Church. That is a Roman Catholic church. In attendance were Dutch officials, ambassadors from the countries which fought in the Netherlands, and of course the veterans. And like many of the events going on in the Netherlands this weekend, this was both a memorial service, but it was also an opportunity for the Dutch people to say thanks to their liberators.
We honor the many thousands of men and women who fought for the liberation of our country. These plates are a token of our profound admiration and gratitude towards those who did not lose heart in Europe's darkest hours.
We are proud to accept these plaques on behalf of our countries, and more particularly for our veterans who gave so much. They have always known that their sacrifice was not in vain. The reception they have been accorded this week has confirmed again, 50 years later, their fight for the liberation of your country was one of the most valuable contributions they could ever make in their lives. Thank you for this confirmation.
CBC's Brian Stewart has been at those ceremonies in Wageningen. Brian, for all of us here, this really is a story of pictures and the faces that we saw. Having been there, what impressions will stay with you?
Well, there's such enormous impressions, the sense of gratitude, which one is really not used to seeing in civilian life all that much. When you're in this funnel of emotion, these rather narrow streets that are just absolutely crammed with people cheering and applauding. These elderly vets, you know, with memories in their eyes and their backs still very stiff as they march down. It was like a funnel of emotion, and the sense of gratitude of all generations, young as well as the old, for these veterans was really quite striking. And it was I've seen it before in D-Day, and it never gets less so, but there was something about today that culminated, that there was a sense of not only the war ended here, but it ended victoriously, and it was at this point on, from May the 5th, 1945, that the Dutch began really to live.
Much is being made, of course, of the special relationship that's developed between the people there and the Canadians who liberated them. Even as a hard-bitten reporter sometimes, it must be hard not to get caught up in some of that feeling. How would you describe the relationship that you see around you?
Well, it's quite extraordinary. I simply have never run into it in any other countries where they've had this degree of affinity between them. They really talk as if they're somehow related. They're stepbrothers or stepsisters, and I don't really know of any other example like it in the world. It's interesting, though, in this parade, there was a great emphasis, not just on the Canadians. They certainly took pride of place, but in other Allied units as well. The Americans, the British, the Poles, who also participated in the liberation of Holland. There was a sense of the United Nations, and of course, soon after 1945, the United Nations was born. It was a feeling that this was an international effort, and here was the beginnings, really, of the United Nations in 1945. You felt that a bit in the parade today, more than a bit, quite a lot.
Was it the beginning, too, Brian, of the kind of role that Canada was going to play on the world stage, that we saw the beginnings there?
I think so. You know, it was very interesting. The last months, the last weeks of that war, Canada was involved in food relief through enemy lines to refugees. It was involved in tense negotiations between the Germans and the resistance. It was, in a way, beginning to do and take part in all these activities which it would later do so well and really invent to some degree with the United Nations in the 1950s. You could almost say, but not quite, it was the beginning of peacekeeping. It was perhaps planting the seed in the brains of a lot of people that humanitarian work could be done even in the midst of war. That continues today.
Brian, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Pleasure, Alison.
When we come back, Brian Stewart looks back at the military campaign in Holland, the battles that brought an end to the suffering of the Dutch people.
I was working, copying the message from Donut's surrender message to the submarines, telling them to all go to the nearest port. And that was exciting to pick that up. That was better transmission. We heard that better. And then Frida Euler was there, and she was jumping up and down. It's over, because she could read the German.
Troops are right at home in winter quarters. Lessons learned in the Canadian bush are put to excellent use. Even hot running water is available, sometimes. Although the bedroom is only a pump set, it's home sweet home, and there are no complaints. Patrols and snipers are briefed before moving out into no man's land. The latest in snowsuits are donned to camouflage the position of riflemen. Daytime recce's mark landmarks and terrain. Night fighters follow the markers. They handle most of the battle patrols, and they're out to do a job on Jerry. Snipers of the Regiment de Chaudière worm their way to a forward vantage point. At a distance, their suits blend perfectly with the snow. They are thus able to take up positions directly overlooking the enemy and carve more notches in the butts of their busy rifles. Action flares up on the Maas River as infantry go forward supported by a steel wall of tanks. In a 2-hour operation, one company of infantry is supported by 3 field regiments of artillery and 3 regiments of armor. A typical Montgomery barrage is laid down as elbow-to-elbow Canadian tanks throw over a fiery sheet of lead. Fighting armor so close together is only feasible with complete control of the air. The Luftwaffe has worries in another direction, attempting to keep Stalin's stalwarts out of Berlin. Canadian armor is thus left free to pound forward from the west.
As we mentioned, many historians believe Canada's role in the Second World War was a turning point, that it defined and shaped us as a nation on the world stage. If that's true, the battles Canadian soldiers fought in Holland and northern Germany were the most important in our history. Here's Brian Stewart on the triumphs and tragedies of the Dutch campaign.
The liberation of Holland was a short but remarkable military operation. because it was both difficult and extremely delicate. In fact, think of a giant hostage rescue mission. Troops not only had to save a Dutch population on the verge of starvation, they also had to make sure the country wasn't devastated. For the occupying Germans were threatening to blow up the famous dikes and inundate the countryside with seawater, which would have destroyed farmlands for a generation. So the rescue had to be both swift and extremely careful. It was undertaken by the war-battered 1st Canadian Army, veterans of bloody fighting in Normandy, the Scheldt, and along the German Rhine River, and by March also arriving veterans of the rugged Italian front. The campaign by the 1st Canadian Army had two distinct parts. First, at the start of April, the Army launched a major offensive towards the north and northeast of Holland and on to Germany by 2nd Corps, the weary Normandy and Rhineland veterans, about 80,000 troops. This 3-week push was the hardest part of the campaign. 2 corps had to cross scores of rivers and canals while fighting through rearguard actions by retreating Germans. General George Kitching remembers their advance with respect and pity.
That was some very tough fighting with fairly exhausted soldiers. They'd been through the Battle of the Hochwald and the Reichswald. They hadn't been reinforced.
The fighting was not as severe as previous major battles. The German resistance was dangerously unpredictable. Many surrendered quickly, others resisted fiercely. Troops faced enormous strain, risking death so close to war's end. While this drive was underway, the second offensive was launched towards Western Holland by the newly arrived and rested 1st Corps, the Italian front veterans. It was a dramatic rescue effort because the heavily populated West, including Amsterdam, faced the greatest starvation danger. 20,000 civilians had already died of hunger.
Canadian soldiers had almost cried when they saw the kids. I sat in a car waiting to have a look at Rotterdam, and I had some sandwiches with me. And as soon as you start to eat them, little heads will appear up the side of the car, peer at you, little guys of about 5 or 6. They'd never seen a chocolate bar, and they'd never seen a sandwich. And so they end up eating our lunch practically at the car, you know.
The advance proceeded with caution to avoid civilian casualties. And when major cities like Apeldoorn were liberated, troops were mobbed by the grateful Dutch.
A truce is declared.
But before reaching Amsterdam, the Western offensive came to a sudden halt on April 19th. Canadians and Germans agreed to a remarkable ceasefire to allow famine relief through to civilians. German commanders were threatened with war crimes trials if they further harmed civilians or continued to flood the country by destroying the dikes. The threats worked. This tense truce continued until May the 5th, when all 130,000 Germans in Holland surrendered.
Scenes of wild rejoicing meet our forces as they liberate town after town until...
The Canadian Army had succeeded in both liberating Holland and preventing devastation, perhaps its crowning military moment.
With all of those memories so vivid, these next few days are a time of remembrance and celebration, not just in the Netherlands, Don, but here in Canada. There'll be ceremonies and across Europe as well.
That's right, Alison. And here in London today, the British memorial ceremonies got underway on the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War with a solemn ceremony in Westminster Hall. Westminster Hall was built by the son of William the Conqueror. It is over 900 years old. But during the war, a lot of people here in London wondered if it would see its 1000th anniversary. Every night, bombing raids, sometimes 2 a night, in the area surrounding the Parliament buildings here in London. The House of Commons was hit. Westminster Hall was damaged, but it was not destroyed and has been refurbished. It is now a magnificent edifice. That was today where the Queen, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, and Princess Margaret, who, like the Queen, was a young woman during the Second World War, came for the ceremony. It was a solemn ceremony remembering the years of hardship, the people who paid with their lives, and also the times, the difficult times that Allied soldiers had in Britain, but also the English people had as well. That theme of sacrifice ran through the address by Her Majesty the Queen to both of Britain's Houses of Parliament, to veterans, and to other dignitaries. Here now are some of the highlights of today's Westminster Hall ceremony.
We come together to give thanks for the sacrifices of the last World War and to celebrate the heroism and valor of those who served in the armed forces of the Crown. We honor the memory of those who gave their lives, whether from our own isles or from overseas, in a common cause.
You know, today when some contemporary writers are busy with their versions of history, I am more than ever certain of one thing. It was a war worth fighting. It was a war worth winning. The price was high, but the consequences of defeat would have been incalculable.
The years of the Second World War formed my youth. I remember my father and mother telling us at home of the courage and unity of purpose they encountered on all sides during their wartime travels, and of the overwhelming sense that we were all united in a common resolve. These memories have remained with me all my life. In making these national acts of thanksgiving this weekend, and again in August when we commemorate the end of the war in the Far East, we must remember especially those who did not come back. As head of the Commonwealth, I want to pay special tribute to the countries of the Commonwealth who, from the onset of war, were by our side. No law passed here at Westminster, no command from London, compelled the Dominions to help us from across the oceans. But help us they did. Let us pledge that the sacrifices made in the war, which ended 50 years ago, should, under the providence of Almighty God, achieve all that they deserved. A lasting peace founded on justice, freedom, and parliamentary government. In this ancient hall, scene of so many great events in our history, I join with you in Parliament assembled in saying in the words of the psalm, "The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will give his people the blessing of peace."
Let us remember those who returned, those whose lives still bear the scars of war, those who lost sight or limbs or reason, those who lost faith in God and hope for humanity. Let us remember.
God grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the Church, the Queen, the Commonwealth, to all people, peace and concord, and to us and all his servants, life everlasting. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen.
From London now to the town of Apeldoorn. It's home base for the CBC journalists and technicians working in Holland this week, and for hundreds of returning Canadian veterans. That's because it's a community with special ties to Canada and the Canadian role in liberating the country. And as David Holton reports, the townspeople have rolled out the red and white carpet in welcome.
To visitors, it looks as if Apeldoorn has gone Canadian. Welcome signs and the maple leaf are everywhere. From atop the old city hall to even the quietest residential streets. This is the day they're remembering, April 17, 1945.
Driving ahead, our armor outflanks the town of Apeldoorn.
Parts of the city were in ruins, some of its residents hungry, but they turned out in hundreds to greet the liberators. Yuri Hultsebus was 19 years old when the first Canadians crossed the canal into Apeldoorn.
It was in the early morning of April the 17th that we got a message, Apeldoorn is free. Then immediately we went out the houses, yelling and shouting and doing all mad things.
Today, Apeldoorn and its 150,000 residents are a picture postcard of peace and prosperity. But you don't meet anyone here, young or old, who isn't aware of what's owed to the Canadians who came to town 50 years ago.
It's difficult for us to imagine how it is to go to a foreign country to liberate that country, because they were sons at that time of mothers. So I'm a mother now, and it's hard, I think.
Very grateful when you see all the people from Canada, but also from other countries here in Apeldoorn.
What do you think? They're all happy. I am happy. And the whole Dutch people are happy.
Okay. Apeldoorners aren't just saying they're grateful to Canadians, they're proving it in scores of different ways. At this bank, for example, all you've got to do is tell them you're Canadian, and they drop all the bank charges on any of your transactions. Tell me, why are you doing this for Canadians?
Well, our manager told us we don't have to take the commission because we were very glad that we have the Canadians here as our guests, our liberators.
So, would you please welcome the Thief River Quartet?
The warmest welcome of all, though, is given the 750 Canadian veterans here for the 50th anniversary. At the local theater, they're serenaded with the old wartime hits the soldiers sang as they waited for battle. And there are special honors for one of the oldest vets, 96-year-old Albert Williams.
What do you remember?
What do I remember?
Yeah.
All I remember was when we cleared the Germans out of the streets. That's what I remember.
The people of Apeldoorn have opened their homes to the vets. Leslie Porter and his wife Suzanne are staying with the Timmer family, wishing that Canadian children could be taught about the liberation the same way Dutch kids are.
We went through about 2 generations and not a mention of the war, what we did or anything. And that we are disappointed.
It's very important that you never forget what the Canadian and the American and also the Polish people do here for the liberation of Holland and also for whole of Europe.
In fact, the children of Apeldoorn, like other Dutch kids, are taught about the Second World War when they're as young as 6. Learning about the liberation here is as important as the 3 R's.
The youth in the schools are being taught about the liberation, and we think that is very important because once you've been occupied for several years, you know what freedom is.
In Apeldoorn's Central Park, older residents come for a few quiet moments and sometimes just to gaze at the town's war memorial, an eternal flame. They tell you here that they will never forget. Not now, not ever.
And that ends this first hour of our special coverage of VE Day ceremonies in Europe. There's more to come. In our second hour, we'll travel to Holten for a tribute to the Canadian soldiers who died liberating Holland. We'll meet some people who did their fighting on the home front. And we'll talk with Canadian veterans who have strong memories of their time in the battle for Europe. Stay with us.
We actually
had VE Day, I guess, a little ahead of time because the German generals signed a peace treaty with Canadian generals before the actual VE Day. And they'd pulled us out back from Oldenburg, and I was a company runner or something, and I saw this secret message come in the orderly room, and of course I opened it immediately, and it said on there that the war was going to be over in a few days, and the officers were not to take any risk with any of the men, that just make sure nobody else got killed or wounded. So I already knew about it quite a bit ahead of time.